Most of what I wanna know is what's going on. What's wrong? How long has it been since you've seen the sun? Made a joke or said a pun, or even made fun of me. You used to make me think that you wanted me. It's so sad to me. How can I mend you now? 1 year, yes, one more by. A little less of my time thinking, little more of my time high. And I wonder why life hangs you out to dry. So I think I might go by the east side. Meet me on the east side of the bridge. We know flying is not right, but you might for what you did. Hang your feet from the east side of the bridge. I know they're near there, or here, there, or taking my ditch. But I don't care, I'll meet you anywhere. So meet me. Rest of what I wanna know, I can't ask. No things stuck in the past that you maybe should have asked about the last time we spoke about pastimes. Like, are you lonely tonight, or were you only lonely that time? Because time won't be the end of another line. Even if this is the end, are you my love or my friend tonight? 1 year, yes, one more by. A little less of my time thinking, a little more of my time high. And I wonder why life hangs you out to dry. So I think I might go by, hang my feet from the east side. Meet me on the east side of the bridge. We know flight is not right, but you might for what you did. Hang your feet from the east side of the bridge. I know they're near there, or here, there, and taking my ditch. But I don't care, I'll meet you anywhere. Meet me on the east side of the bridge. We'll let the sunrise be both of our alibis. So meet me. You're like the sea I'm sinking in, falling 1,000 leagues in love. And if I were to meet my demise, I wouldn't regret no rise above. And if you were to wear a disguise, baby, your eyes would be enough to see your worth lies far within. I believe I found a diamond in the rough, and I wanna do something with this life I'm lucky to live, for this world I'm living in, so I'll never stop loving. Because I am a man made up of more than just the sum of all my parts. And baby, I believe your body is a work of art. So show me an open mind, and I will hold you in my arms, so you can feel my heart beat faster for you. Can't you feel my heart beat faster for you? Can't you feel my heart beat so much faster for you? I stand stressed and looking at a mess from the corner by my bedroom door. I never want to see her anymore. I now know nothing could ever be what I thought it could be before. But my eyes keep slipping towards the door. You slip away and out from under my soul implore.
I've run out of you time, and I will no longer lend you any of mine. As a man I plan to enjoy your curving line, but the sand in your hourglass has become too fine. Think less than I should about the mess that I left on my bedroom floor. After all, she had to be ignored. Slip away and out from under my soul implored.
'Cause I run out of you time, and I will no longer lend you any of mine. As a man I plan to enjoy your curving line, but the sand in your hourglass has become too fine. And I want to see her ever again no more. Yeah, yeah. And I won't see her ever again no more. It's my pleasure, baby, no more. Oh, because I've run out of you time, and I will no longer lend you any of mine.
As a man I plan to enjoy your curving line, but the sand in your hourglass has become too fine.
Yeah,
the river of our love has run dry. As dark and cold and empty as your eyes. As I arrive outside your lonely door, you realize that time ain't on your side no more. It's just about time. Oh, 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 oh.
You feel it a bit unfair. There's no one there to look after you. Your disciples are scared, but
They will all come back to you.
Yeah,
They will all come back to you.
But
Nobody there means no one to share your last meal with. Your spirit's in disrepair. You wonder if Siddhartha wished all the Buddha. Was he scared? Hope his people make it back to hell. Hope his people make it back to hell.
Was Jesus Father fair? Was justice done there on that limb? God's hand must have been scared, because the devil's always after him. Yeah, the devil's always after him. Oh, Apollo, can we be spared and wait for impending disaster? Oh, does anything care? Oh, they ride in sorrow as to in darkness after? Oh, you, are you even there? Or is it life in darkness after? Oh, is it life in darkness after? Oh, you.
What the fuck's going on, guys? Alright, so we just finished the Shogun series, and so
You have nothing to prove to
I'm gonna watch the
that man was
motherfucking
going to kill himself up on that cliff.
podcast,
He risked
because
his
it's
life
time
to
for the
save you.
dopest dope you ever smoked.
And then when he was done for in those waves, he didn't fight. Could have tried, but he just turned and drew his blade. He chose his death. What better
He
end
chose
can a man
his
hope for?
death.
Will I die here? Likely.
Welcome to Shogun, the official podcast. My name is Emily Yoshida. I was a staff writer on this show and helped adapt James Clavell's beloved novel into the show you see today. The writer's
Book
room
was
spent
great.
months creating
Fucking
this
loved
story,
that book.
but the premiere of the show has been years in the making. So many other contributors, from the actors to stunt choreographers to translators and researchers, have all brought
Actors
FX's
didn't contribute
Shogun to
shit.
life.
Who you kidding?
On this podcast, we're going to connect the pieces. After each episode of the show, we'll dive deeper into the different elements that went into making it. Each week, I'll be talking with co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo, and we'll hear behind-the-scenes stories from the cast and crew. We'll also go deeper into the real-life chapter of Japanese history that inspired the events of this story. This week, we're talking about the pilot episode, Anjin, which you may have noticed means pilot in Japanese.
I
but
didn't
the
notice,
boat
and that
kind,
was
not
the
TV kind.
fucking
And heads
biggest
up, there will
brain
be
blast I
spoilers
think
for
I've
this
ever
episode,
had.
So I highly recommend you go watch it first and then come back here and join us afterwards. And I'd also like to give
The
a quick
name of the
content warning
pilot
that this episode will include
is pilot
discussions about
in
suicide.
Japanese, but it's
So
the
today
name
on
of the
pod,
pilot
actor
of the
and
ship.
producer Hiroyuki Sanada, who plays Toranaga in the series, reveals what bonded the Japanese and American film crews on set. I talked to historian Frederick Krenz about the real-world counterparts of each of our main characters, and costume designer Carlos Rosario talks about
Oh
the
yeah,
secret
Fox
behind
Warrior
all that
Gaming. I
samurai armor
appreciate
you see
the
on screen.
appreciate the
But
follow.
first, let's go back to the very beginning.
What drew us to Shogun was that there is such a great throwback classic adventure epic told through an entirely different lens.
This is Shogun co-creator and showrunner Justin Marks.
The novel Shogun is a great page turner, first of all, and a really layered tapestry of a lot of characters. And the best way to describe it is it's a story of a crucial moment in Japanese history, a moment when they had been coming out of many
Perfect
decades of
podcast to
civil
watch
war.
while we
And we're
play
still in kind of a
Rise
transitional
of the
period,
Ronin.
moving
Let's
from
go.
the Sengoku Jidai into what would become the Edo period. And the story is reasonably loyal to the history of Japan, with a lot of conflations and a lot of characters who have been kind of omitted or simplified and moved around. And then it takes that story and it deposits this character of John Blackthorne, who's based on the real life William Adams, an explorer, to use that term generously, who came to Japan and forged really strong diplomatic ties with the Japanese power structure in some ways with Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was the model for Toranaga, the lead character of our show, and then in other ways just with other religious and political figures at the time.
Yeah, this book has had such a pull for so long. And I think a lot of people maybe even know it from their parents having read the book. But what would you say is the thing that is like the draw that beyond just being this like really fascinating, detailed historical, fiction? What's the juice there for you?
What I remember most about, what we talked about in the writer's room when we were building this show was it felt like we couldn't just do a story that sort of dealt with some of the tropes that you would associate with Stranger in a Strange Land, where here I come into this place and look, they have paper walls and they eat raw fish and imagine all these amazing things. We had to find a different reason for being. What really excited me was to say, well, it is a story about globalization. It's a story about cultures meeting each other, and of course, in a time when it hadn't happened much, but we're going to interpret it through the lens of the globalization that we have today. And so what are the issues that become important to us as a civilization? And I think those issues are really interesting when it comes to matters of empathy, matters of agency, who gets to speak for whom, who gets to speak for themselves, what expectations we have as outsiders coming into a new world, and what expectations we have as insiders when an outsider shows up into our culture.
Yeah, you were talking about what it feels like for this culture to be seeing these foreigners. I mean, granted, as we understand, they're not the first Europeans to be there, but they are a new kind of European. They're speaking a different language. When we hear English on the show, in our kind of understanding of the show, that's not English, right?
No,
for the most
not
part.
at all.
Yeah,
right. It was sort of our lingua franca that we decided on early on, and there's a lot of precedence for this. Silence is a good example I can think of. Right, that dealt with it, where if you have European characters speaking, for the most part, they're really speaking Portuguese, almost entirely. When Blackthorn finds himself speaking to the Japanese, the only language that any Japanese might know that wasn't Japanese to speak to him with would be Portuguese. And William Adams, historically, and John Blackthorn, the fictional character, both spoke a number of languages, so it would make sense that Portuguese could be his way of getting in with them. I would also say, if you're really thinking about it in the first episode, when Blackthorn's speaking to the men in the pit, he'd also, of course, be speaking Dutch. So really, there's almost no opportunity for him to speak actual English in the story. But in our case, we had to make some exceptions to that.
A majority of the show's dialogue is in Japanese, but our writer's room was entirely English speaking, writing scripts in English. One might assume that this was just a matter of translating those scripts from English to Japanese, but there was actually a lot more to it than that, right?
Yeah.
Just tell me a little bit about the translation process here.
So we went through this very detailed process to say, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right, where we would, of course, all of us wrote it in English.
Right.
Worked with a producer on the show who I would call kind of the voice in my ear from a cultural point of view, just to sort of make certain adjustments, as in someone wouldn't have said that kind of thing or been that direct with that kind of idea. So then we made some adjustments accordingly. Then we would send it to a team of translators in Tokyo who would kind of translate it into a modern Japanese of sorts, and they would hand that to a Japanese playwright who specialized in jidaigeki and period Japanese, who spoke no English and would rewrite that dialogue into a more polished prose. And then that would, be performed. And when we did the subtitles, we translated back not from the script, but from the Japanese, we translated it again into English. And so the subtitles that you're reading on screen have gone through about 9 steps to get to where they are. And we're really proud of the attention to that detail, because I hope it shows an effort to say, if we're going to do the active translation, we're going to get it right, and we're going to do something that's very special.
Well, just episode 1, there's so much that's thrown at us in the first hour, and, a lot to take in, a lot of characters that are introduced. Is there anything that you personally really hope the viewer catches that maybe might fly under the radar? Any interesting stories?
I think one of the most important stories of this entire show happens in the first episode. And I remember in the writer's room, we were really slow to understand its impact early on. And it took conversations with a lot of our Japanese advisors, Japanese producers, before I really finally began to understand the power of Tadayoshi's gesture in the very early scene of the first episode, when that young samurai stands up and crosses the line, steps over the tatami with the sword almost drawn in the ceremonial meeting hall to speak in protest of the way all of these regions are speaking to his lord, Toranaga. That Tadayoshi would stand up in the name of his lord, realize that he's then jeopardized all of their safety for having done so, and then not just offer up himself for sacrifice, but also offer up his own child. And the scene speaks to this idea of just what one has to give up in order to truly serve a cause. And I think that the story of Fuji's baby's death, this baby that she offers up to death because her husband pledged it in order to make a peace, really has ripple effects throughout the story. So something I hope people pay close attention to.
Shogun's story revolves around the powerful but inscrutable Lord Toranaga, a master tactician whose motives and secrets are often known only to himself. For an actor, conveying that complexity could prove to be quite a challenge.
Luckily, I played Ieyasu Tokugawa, the model of Yoshi Toranaga, before in Japan.
This is actor Hiroyuki Sanada, known for his roles in The Last Samurai, John Wick, and 47 Ronin. But even with the previous experience playing Toranaga's historical counterpart, Hiro took on a new challenge with Shogun. He worked as both the star and producer to maintain the story's authenticity.
As a producer, I could hire experienced Japanese crew for the wig, costume, props, everything. And then master of gesture. It's very important.
Yeah.
How to sit, how to stand up, how to walk, how to serve.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of things are very important. Even hard for the Japanese young actors. So we should teach them from the beginning. So we started from there. And after all these kind of things during the preparation time, finally I put my wig and costume and then sat on set and then speaking dialogue.
Yeah.
That was the easiest part for me and the enjoyable part.
Yeah, I bet.
So I just enjoyed playing my role. I was on set every day, every single day as a producer.
Yeah.
Before the director coming, check the props, set design, costume, extras, movement, then bring the director and start. So when I start acting, I was like, ooh, finally, I'm free now. Just live as Toranaga.
Yeah.
So that feeling was first time for me, but it was so fun.
Were there any fun stories from behind the scenes that you remember from shooting the pilot?
Yeah, so many memories. I don't know where should I start. My son, Nagakado, Yuki. I spent good time, father and son, bonding time. So we went to shopping together, supermarket. What shall we eat tonight? Okay, let's do barbecue. And during shooting, we had a nice catering team, Western food, Japanese food. And we separated in the line for the lunchtime, but little by little, crossover, Western crew tried to eating Japanese food, and then Japanese cast and crew eating Western food, and then, what did you eat today? Da, 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 da. Those kind of conversation made us great atmosphere on set.
Yeah.
East meets West.
Yeah, it's just, the whole theme of the show at Crafty.
Yeah.
Wow. So our first introduction of Toranaga in our first episode is with him and his falcon, his beloved falcon.
Yes, my favorite.
And this is sort of a running theme. Did you actually handle the falcons?
Yeah.
And, oh wow.
Before start shooting, we had a boot camp and training.
Oh wow.
For the samurai movement, horseback riding, everything, and falcon training.
Wow.
That was my mission, to control him until start shooting. And especially the falcon scene was my first day in whole shooting.
Because it shot chronologically, right? Pretty much.
Yeah. He was only 2 weeks old, but already trained well.
Oh my gosh.
And his name was Shogun. So, like, he was born for this show.
The falconry is such a big part of Toranaga's character, and he's, it becomes a metaphor, I think, for a lot down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like you learned anything about Toranaga through working with the falcons and with the birds?
Yeah, I knew the falcon hunting was a good training for the samurais,
Mm.
and then I learned Ieyasu loved hunting
Mm.
with a falcon or hawk.
Yeah.
And so during the shooting, I could feel, why he loved. Because we can learn a lot, we're in the best timing to learning about the patient, wait, and, and controlling people equal control falcon. So kind of same system there.
Yeah.
I could feel that.
One of the first examples we see of Toranaga and his strategic mind is in the meeting of the regents, which is already a very tense scene before Tadayoshi, the young samurai, steps on the tatami mat and almost causes a bloodbath. And there's so much going on in this scene that's kind of going unsaid. Can you describe what's going on in Toranaga's head in this moment?
Yeah, Tadayoshi said something, and then maybe Toranaga was, oh my gosh. What are you doing, boy? I have a plan here.
Yeah.
Don't bother me. But I know his braveness. So stop him, but I'm happy the other hand, because that's samurai way.
Yeah.
I know, not the,
You see that he's willing to risk his life to defend his lord.
Yeah, but step onto tatami mat or even not draw the sword. Just holding the sword, the scabbard, that's enough.
Yeah.
So have to be committed to seppuku or start fighting immediately.
Yeah.
So all or nothing. So Toranaga has no choice. So of course sad, but he loves the samurai spirit.
This week on Shogun, Tadayoshi stands by with the rest of Toranaga's vassals as the Council of Regents accuses their leader of treachery. When he can no longer bear this dishonor, Tadayoshi stands and puts his hand on his sword in defiance of the council. But when he realizes this action has endangered his lord, he asks for permission to end his family bloodline. When faced with extreme circumstances, samurai were known to take their own life, and even those of their families, in a ritual known as seppuku. This act sent a powerful message. In Tadayoshi's case, it was a message of atonement to reclaim his honor and express commitment to his lord. But seppuku could also be a form of protest to proclaim innocence or to express disagreement with the lord's decision. Whatever the reason, seppuku was a solemn act taken seriously by one's allies and enemies alike. Typically, once a samurai had decided to end their life, they would enlist what we refer to on the show as a second. This was a trusted friend, a fellow warrior, or family member who would help them in the process. They would compose a death poem, serving as their final words. And then when it was time to do the deed, the samurai would take their short sword, or wakizashi, and turn it on themselves, making a deep, semicircular cut across their lower abdomen. This cut was intentionally fatal and obviously extremely painful. Once it had been made, and the samurai had effectively guaranteed their own death, the second would be ready to step in and deliver a quick, merciful strike to end their suffering. During the Edo period, which comes directly after the events of Shogun, seppuku became highly ritualized. This is often how we see the act depicted in pop culture now. The samurai would wear white robes, as we see Tadayoshi wearing for his seppuku, and the action would be performed in front of an audience. In the Sengoku period, where our story takes place, seppuku was typically a much more private act. It was done in a quiet, intimate setting behind closed doors. While hard to comprehend from a modern perspective, death was a part of life for many Japanese people at the time. With over 100 years of warring samurai factions, people were accustomed to lives being lost. The Sengoku period is not depicted on screen nearly as often as the more famous Edo period, and it was quite a different time in a lot of really important ways. Thankfully, Shogun was lucky enough to have one of the authorities on all things Sengoku on our research team. He's a Japanese historian living in Kyoto who, coincidentally, emigrated from the Netherlands, just like the crew of the Erasmus.
My name is Frederick Keynes. I am a professor of Japanese history at International Research Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto, Japan. And my field of research is basically the Sengoku period.
I want to first ask about Tadayoshi and his seppuku. Would it be common for samurai like him to face a death sentence just for interrupting an important meeting?
So it's Tadayoshi himself who asked the permission to commit seppuku and to kill his son. There are a lot of misconceptions about seppuku, and they originate in the Edo period, because seppuku in the Edo period became more of a sentence of punishment, while originally seppuku was something you did by yourself. In most cases, when you're on the brink of defeat, they would commit seppuku. When they did something which they thought was not honorable, they would commit seppuku, but that was their own decision. For a samurai, seppuku was something special. It was a way to show their courage.
It's kind of both a privilege to do it, but also kind of almost a social
Yes,
responsibility
indeed,
in a way too.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like a big part of the appeal of Shogun at any point has been the historical accuracy, and that you feel like you're really in this world and really get to know it. So I kind of wanted to go through just and very briefly the real life counterparts of these three characters. So let's start with Toranaga.
The historical equivalent of Toranaga is Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was one of the most powerful warlords at the time, and he was member of the Council of Regents. But he was in a quite precarious situation because the other regents were plotting against him. And it was not sure for him if he could keep his power. Then we have John Blackstone. His equivalent is William Adams. And it was just in 1600, in this period of political instability, that he washed ashore on a Dutch ship in Japan. He was just an English pilot, so normally he wasn't permitted to see such a great warlord as Ieyasu was, but in some way or another, Ieyasu ordered him to come to Osaka to have an audience with him. Then we have Mariko, Hosokawa Gracia, and she again plays a very important role in the political atmosphere at the time. Gracia was a very important figure, very high standing from the Akechi family. So these three main characters are the basis of the story, but they all have their equivalents in history.
Pretty much every element of Shogun involved painstaking historical research, and I'll talk to Frederick more about it in the coming weeks. But bringing this research to life also took enormous attention to detail, and just minutes into the first episode, you can see that detail on display in the costumes.
Now, something that is interesting is that period, the samurais were not wearing a uniform in which all of them were wearing exactly the same armor. The samurais were wearing actually their own clothes, right? So there was a diversity of chaos in their clothes. Everybody was wearing something a little bit different.
This is costume designer Carlos Rosario, who created the outfits for everyone from the Dutch sailors to Japanese fishermen to the samurai lords.
You know, it was really interesting to understand the language of the clothing at that period. You know, it's at the end of sort of like a period of chaos before this economic growth that happens in the Edo period in Japan. So I was fascinated about that period of transition. By doing a lot of research, and actually at some point even I was able to speak with the daughter of Mr. Kurosawa.
Oh, wow.
Who's a costume designer
cool.
in Japan.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I was able to understand that regardless of how linear the silhouettes of the clothing for men and women look at that period, the intricacy, the details, the layering, the way they get dressed is completely different based on what your rank is and based on the circumstances that you are in. And that was maybe the most complicated part of this show, because it wasn't like in other TV shows where you can create a closet for each character and then you keep reusing the same costumes. All these characters sort of progress so much throughout the storyline that I had to understand that for every single one of the situations, I had to design something specifically for that moment. And that was the complicated part of the show.
Yeah.
For me. but at the same time, incredibly interesting.
Yeah. But there are some characters who do definitely have their own style that's very specific.
Mhm.
I mean, Yabushige's feather dress. I mean, it's just
Oh,
such a
yes.
fantastic piece of costuming. For that one specifically, what inspired that? Where did that come from?
Okay, that one is one of my favorite costumes. And actually, it's one of, the Jimbauri, which is the top layer, that vest that goes over the armor, is one of Justin Marks, our showrunner, favorite piece,
Yeah.
right? And so that look, well, let's just say that first, that I think what's important for the audience to understand is that, a lot of these characters are actually based on real characters, right? So for us, when we started doing all the research, we started doing the research on the armors that Yabushige, Toranaga, and all these different people wore, right? And after that, we did our own interpretation. And I think the Jimbauri, it came because when I spoke with the daughter of Mr. Kurosawa, I asked her a question, and I asked the question of when all these lords that are bigger than life, right, so powerful, they go to, for example, small villages, do they tone down their costumes? And I remember her very specifically telling me, Carlos, actually, it's the reverse. When they go to the countryside, the more they can show through their clothing how powerful they are, the better it is. And she said, in terms of the Jimbauris, she said, there are no rules, so you can go for it. So just get as creative as possible. And so to me, Yabushige was such an interesting character and so complex, but I thought he was a bit of a rock star. The first time we see him, it comes to Ajiro and just with all his feathers and I just wanted to make him just a little bit like more edgy than everybody else.
Yeah. And he's got to keep those villagers in line too. They've got
Totally. Yes, exactly.
Was there anything that really just was not at all what you expected as far as, how these people were dressing? Like what was, the kind of norm, the standard for people?
I think what really shocked me the most is the time that it takes to actually dress somebody with any of these outfits. Yeah. It takes about 2 people, maybe 1 hour and 15 minutes. It's a lot of work to dress. And, when you do the research and you see all these different silhouettes for man and woman, it just seems so simple. And then when you get into it, it's so complicated, it's so architectural. And there's such a very specific way of dressing everybody that, that becomes very, very complicated, and we wanted to get it right. And so we could do our research, but then thanks to our fittings with all these Japanese actors that have so much experience, we're able to understand the little tricks, of how to dress them. And like, for example, Toranaga in the beginning, when we did his, like the sash, the belts, right? In the beginning, we did it like in silk, and it was pretty smooth, right? And then he said that he wanted something a bit more like a raw silk with more texture because it would be easier for him to kind of actually tie it because it could grab the fabric much better.
Right.
So it was little details like that that made a big difference and that helped us throughout all the 10 episodes to know more and more about the clothing and how to dress people.
Yeah. So that armor, once you had it all manufactured and we're getting ready to ship it out, did you ever get a chance to try it on yourself?
So actually, it's really interesting. So I've before the show, I never wore samurai armor, right? And what we did before, as I was prepping the show, is that we rented an armor from Japan. And so I had it shipped to Vancouver. And myself, and I still have the pictures, I wore that armor because I wanted to experience how heavy it was, right? And that one was very, very heavy. And I remember thinking that for everything that our actors needed to do and perform in terms of action and how long they needed to wear those armors, they needed to be as light as possible.
Right.
So what I did is that I made them in leather.
Oh, wow.
Because I thought it would feel more organic, more in touch with what they would be able to make at that period, And so I thought that it would represent more that period, the way it would have been manufactured, but also it would help in terms of the lightness. And I remember the first time that our lead actor, Hiro-san, wore the armor, he said, "This is the lightest armor I've ever worn."
Wow.
And we never, ever had anybody in 10 episodes complaining about the armor.
Oh,
So that was amazing.
That's all for this week's episode of Shogun, the official podcast. Next week, how will Blackthorn be received in Osaka? And will the embattled Lord Toranaga see him as a friend or an enemy? Tune in next time when we discuss episode 2 of FX's Shogun. You can find a link in our description to episode 1 of Shogun. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of our story, check out the official Shogun Viewer's Guide. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. Be sure to rate, review, and follow Shogun, the official podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Emily Yoshida, and I'll see you next week.
Sato would like this place. Very.
Hear me, my son. I alone will tell you the truth. If Toranagi claimed you as an ally, you'll never leave Japan alive.
Welcome to Shogun, the official podcast. My name is Emily Yoshida, and I was a writer on the series. And after each episode, I'll be diving deeper into the different elements that went into making Shogun, with co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo, along with the cast and crew that brought this story to life. This week, we're talking about everything that happens in episode 2, so be sure to watch the show before listening because there are spoilers ahead. Okay, everybody caught up? On the podcast today, I'll hear about what Blackthorn sees in Yabushige from actor Cosmo Jarvis. We'll learn why some characters' names in the original book had to be changed for the show from producer Eriko Miyagawa. And director Jonathan Van Tulleken tells us why he thinks Ishido is actually a sympathetic villain. But first, episode 2 introduces us to the many conflicts going on inside and outside Japan as we open our story.
We have almost 200 years that pass of civil infighting. Basically just all these warlords who were very powerful squabbling over who was going to be the guy.
This is Shogun executive producer and co-creator Rachel Kondo. And when she came aboard this project, it was her first time reading James Clavell's novel.
We spent a couple of weeks, reading 8 hours a day. And it was, it might sound long and tedious, but it was truly a page turner with unforgettable characters. We didn't really know what we were going to go into it with, but kind of made our way.
So in adapting the show, obviously there was this huge language component of it. And we were working really, really hard to make sure that the script was going to be accurate when we translated it from English and sort of into a period language for the actors to read. And this is obviously a very complicated process, and the dialogue could go through some real changes by the time it was spoken by the actors. So were there any cases you remember where the translation actually really changed what was said on the show?
Well, one instance that comes to mind is at the end of episode 1, when Toranaga is discussing with Mariko what is about to happen. He has come across this barbarian ship and he'd like her to translate for him. And they get to this point in the conversation where he says to her, I need to know, is this going to conflict with your faith to be, basically translating for a heretic? And she says to him, and what was in the script was, she says to Toranaga, it would be a problem if I was only one thing. And how that came, it went to the Japanese, and how that was performed by the great Anna Sawai was that it came back, I have more than one heart. And I thought that was a beautiful, much more spiritually accurate way to put it. And so we stuck with it.
We're talking about episode 2 this week, and this episode really kind of starts to get into the meat of both the political situation that Blackthorn has found himself in after washing up ashore in Japan, and kind of the dynamics between all of these different regions. So can you go into a little more detail about what kind of sets Ishido and Toranaga at odds with each other?
So I think one of my favorite sequences of episode 2 is Ishido's morning routine. It's a small little snippet that we kind of run through what he goes through in private, but it also kind of adds up to what exactly bugs Ishido about Toranaga. I mean, he looks at his battle armor in the beginning. And then at the end of that sequence, he's looking to the Taiko's battle armor, which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
And Ishido's battle armor, it's fine. It's like functional, but not that impressive. And I think he's just, he feels the weight of that bureaucrat's stamp as the difference between them. And, I think that Toranaga, who was born Minowara, it's a legendary, almost mythological family clan who ruled for many, many years. It's going to just rankle someone like Ishido because Toranaga was that kind of guy who he's born a leader, whereas Ishido has to become one. So he's going to have that chip on his shoulder, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people might be surprised to know that Ishido, both the character in the series and the real life Ishida, was a peasant. He did not grow up as a samurai noble person and which is the same as the Taiko, right? Too.
Yeah,
Right?
the Taiko also basically clawed his way into power. And I think that that's a huge difference between how they did that versus someone like Toranaga, who he is a person of legend in that society. And I think it goes into his style of not ruling, but Toranaga is a strategist, right? I think that the Ishidos of the world and the Taikos of the world, they would fight tooth and nail and take what they want and claim for themselves what they feel is their due. But someone like Toranaga has a completely different strategy.
Yeah. Did you have any favorite moments from this episode, or fun memories from the production of it?
Well, I guess that opening scene would probably be my favorite moment, simply because immediately you're just drawn into this beautifully lit scene and this decadence. It's just visually decadent. And our director, Jonathan Van Telken, I think did a great job of bringing us into this moment that visually looks so different from anything we've ever seen. You can hear the chanting in the background. And then we kind of bring it down to almost a child's level, and we watch a very human thing pass before us. And so, yeah, I would say that was my favorite of the episode.
Yeah, I love that scene. And I think it's so nice because oftentimes Toranaga, especially in this first part of the story, can seem so distant and calculating and kind of this unreadable person. But, his friendship with the Taiko was real. And you can really see that in that moment.
Oh, and the other great thing about that scene is how it establishes the tensions between Toranaga and Ochiba.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, those dagger eyes.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, can I say one quick thing? Because
sure.
it's this one moment in the episode that someone might easily miss, in which Mariko and Blackthorn are discussing bathing. And in the background, you see Setsu, who is Mariko's lady in waiting. And she basically glides across the floor in this. She was like a liquid, she just glides across the floor, and she just moves in this way that is so stunning because you can't fake that kind of stuff. I tried it myself. I was not able to even bow, the way that they bow. And to do that whole fluid moment or movement all at once was, I think, something to point out. So,
yeah, the movement training is something that once you know about it, you really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that specific person who played Setsu, Akiko Kobayashi, she was one of the Shosa instructors.
Oh, right.
And she exists like that in real life. I mean, she would glide in and out of the production office, and you can't help but marvel.
Caught in the center of the political storm is John Blackthorn, the pilot who charted a course around the world and washed up on the shores of Japan.
My dad's he's a celestial navigator. He's a seaman, and he tried to explain how celestial navigation works, and my mathematics is pretty substandard, so a lot of that went over my head.
Playing the role of Blackthorn is actor Cosmo Jarvis.
But I did learn that the planet was not a sphere. It was an oblate spheroid, which means it's not a perfect sphere, which I didn't know.
To embody the character, Cosmo looked to better understand the pilot/pirate Blackthorn.
At the time, I was sort of trying to look at the practical aspects of what his occupation entailed, like being a pilot, and looked into the state of the Protestants and Catholics at the time and how the Pope allocated land.
So episode 2 kind of starts off with this first meeting between Toranaga and Blackthorn. It's such an interesting scene, both in terms of, these are going to be our two characters. This is kind of their first impression of each other, but also in terms of the way the translation works in it. I mean, they can't understand each other, but there is this, something is happening there in that scene. What do you think that Blackthorn sees in Toranaga in that first meeting?
I think he straight away sees that Toranaga is a force to be reckoned with. I think Hiro really wears Toranaga very naturally and thickly, and he's a presence in and of himself. And so when all of that happened, there was nothing else to inform any of that from the point of view of the person whose job it was to portray Blackthorn. It felt like a very long period of sussing each other out. We did a lot of that, and finding non-verbal common ground through other forms of communication like body language and the sincerity of the decorum that Blackthorn might have, or lack of decorum in some cases, that Blackthorn would have displayed toward him.
I mean, it's such a delicate relationship. I think it must have been to act between you two and to grow over the course of the series. Was there anything you guys did on set, just off camera to kind of maintain that dynamic or build that relationship?
We didn't spend a lot of time chit-chatting, which I think was very good, because it meant that when we got to those kind of introductory scenes between Toranaga and Blackthorn, the process of being in each other's company as characters began to take shape naturally, as it would with all of the sort of mysticism of being strangers that we had anyway. And that worked out well.
So Blackthorn experiences some serious whiplash in this episode. I mean, first he's dragged into Toranaga's court, basically like one of the most powerful men in Japan. And then from there, he's tossed into this filthy prison in Osaka. It's just a lot. So what was it like to kind of be taken from one extreme to the other while you're shooting this episode?
I mean, initially when we got to the Father Domingo scene, I was finding it difficult to reconcile the fact that in the book, he spends a huge amount of time in this prison. It was quite hard to nail down the amount of fictional time that he was supposed to have been there in this adaptation. In the book, the sheer misery of the conditions in that prison have a profound effect on him, and they have a profound effect on how he relates to Father Domingo. The whole prison could almost just be a book in the book.
I mean, it does make you think about the fact, like in episode 1, he spends a lot of time in a pit getting fish guts dumped on him.
Yes.
There's a lot of brutality toward Blackthorn and his men in the first couple episodes. It does feel like it maybe negatively impacts Blackthorn's idea of, this culture.
Yes, and I think that those parts in particular must have come from James Clavell's experience as a prisoner of war. I only found out that he was a prisoner of war afterwards, and then it made sense about how those particular parts were so brutally realized. But Domingo seemed like a nice chap. So, and I think he is one of the few truly helpful and sort of semi-caring presences that Blackthorn comes across in those early days. But then he gets removed from the prison quite quickly anyway, and on to the next problem.
Yeah. So he's eventually rescued by Yabushige, and the relationship between Blackthorn and Yabushige is just so rich. How do you see their relationship and how it grows over the series? What do they see in each other?
They both recognize that the other one is sort of fighting as hard as the other one. Not fighting anything in particular, but just in a fight with their own life, I think. And it's obvious by the situations that they both find themselves in and the sort of renegade quality of Yabushige. I think Blackthorn finds that fairly relatable because, again, everything is sort of translinguistic or non-verbal, all their communication, but it's very prevalent with Yabushige that there's so much fight in him and so much sort of enigmatic kind of... Well, it's like he's a villain that can't be a villain because nobody should like a villain that much as much as you like Yabushige. And I think that's what happens to Blackthorn. And I think that on the cliff the communication between them that transcends anything that could ever be put into words. It's that there's something just very human about him. And there's something about the way that Yabushige kind of toys with Blackthorn that I think Blackthorn recognizes from his own attitude towards Catholics. And I think he kind of can't help but respect the fact that Yabushige gives him the same kind of shit for being a foreign barbarian and making him bark like a dog and, or you know, just call himself a dog and these kinds of things. And I think that in some kind of beautifully messed up way, their worst traits bring them together.
What was the kind of off-screen relationship like with Asano? I heard there was a lot of improv.
There was, yes, there was at times. We were sort of always trying to find stuff in between the written lines, which is something I wasn't used to. But Tadanobu kind of sucks you in. He's the improvised kind of noises that he makes in between words convey more in some cases than any line ever could, and it was great. I loved working with him. He's amazing.
It must have been kind of a meta experience to both be playing this character who's one of the only people who doesn't speak Japanese in the story, but at the same time also be on a set where you're one of the only actors who doesn't speak Japanese. I was just wondering if that real life experience that you were experiencing every day, did that inform your understanding of what Blackthorn was going through?
One of the things that I noticed from being on set is if somebody was translating something in Japanese to a Japanese person that I had said in English, the only thing that I could really do to gauge how what I said might have been penetrating the person's brain that I was saying it to was the expression on their face. And it was very much the same with this, because you could kind of gauge the quality of your translator by the look on the person's face that you were speaking to.
Shogun's bilingual production mirrors the complex, layered communication of the characters in the story. From poetry to translations to delicate wordplay, the power of language hangs over all the events unfolding in Osaka. In the middle of it all is Blackthorn, at the mercy of those who can communicate for him. The Japanese language is not easily translated into English. Among the challenges is that courtesy and manners are imbued into speaking in a way that has no direct English equivalent. An early European missionary in Japan once wrote, "It is impossible to learn the language without, at the same time, learning to speak with dignity and respect." The art of proper respect is a delicate matter. In Japanese, prefixes and honorifics are added to denote familiarity, superiority, and inferiority. When referring to an object that belonged to someone of a higher station, a samurai would start with the prefix o, go, or on. For instance, yashiki, or mansion, becomes o yashiki when a samurai refers to his lord's residence. Japanese also uses honorifics on people's names to denote their standing. In contemporary Japanese, you may hear people use san at the end of a name to signal respect, which is more or less equivalent to Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. During the Sengoku period, the more formal sama was used, which is why we often hear the name Toranaga-sama on the show. A lack of any honorific, to just say Toranaga, either indicated extreme familiarity or contempt.
There are so many ways to say one thing in one language, and then, there's no such thing as direct translations. Never a dull moment.
This is producer Eriko Miyagawa, whose job it was to oversee the use of Japanese language throughout the show.
Our goal was to make it a historically authentic show. So I think in terms of language and dialogue front, I think what we really focused on pushing the authenticity of it, but, also making sure that modern audience can find it accessible.
So much of the show revolves around a character who's entirely Japanese speaking, Lord Toranaga, and the actor who plays him, Hiroyuki Sanada, was also a producer on the show. So I was wondering, was he like an on-set producer? Like, what was he doing on the set to kind of ensure this accuracy?
Yeah, it's sort of like, what is he not doing? He's wears so many hats. I still remember Like the day one, he shows up in sort of all black. He looks like he could be in a grip department, black tracksuit and, baseball cap. And it's COVID, so everybody's masked up. And and so nobody knew who he was. And, he's kind of wandering around, getting coffee from Crafty and listening to all the dialogues, fixing background if they're walking funny or, carrying sword in the wrong way. He's like getting in there.
There's so much about language and about, getting into kind of these very specific titles and the way that people speak to each other and show respect to one another. Can you explain some for viewers who are kind of all coming to this for the first time? Like, what are all these different titles that we're hearing and what do they mean?
It's considered rude to address somebody just by their names. Like Hiro, in English, I would call him Hiro, but in Japanese, I would always call him Sanada-san. And then Dono, which is still very respectful, but slightly more equal.
Mm-hmm.
So you would notice, Ishido addressing Kiyama as Kiyama Dono or Sugiyama Dono,
right,
because they're sort of colleagues. Sometimes they switch around depending on who's talking to who and, what the relationship is. And it's tricky. It's never, there are a lot of gray areas to that as well. So even for us, like on set, we're like, wait, should it be Tono or should it be?
Right.
We're constantly adjusting and making decisions. Even like simple word like I, there could be multiple ways to say it depending on your class or gender or, who you're talking to.
I was going to ask about that because I've just always noticed what people are referring to themselves as. And I noticed, and maybe this is more of a historical thing, but a lot more of the men say watashi than like boku. Nobody, like people aren't saying.
Oh yeah, boku is modern. Like samurai would address oneself as sessha or soregashi. Kind of all depends on the setting and, the context. So yeah, it's always like when, on set when Justin or actors have requests to, for last minute dialogue change or, requests to improvise. And we're like, oh, give me 1 minute. But luckily Hiro has such a great handle he's done so many period shows. So he has very good handle of these type of language.
So readers of Clavel's books and people who've seen the miniseries before will notice that almost none of the names are the same besides our 3 leads. They've all been changed. And that was, I think that was a very big creative decision on the part of the show for Justin and Rachel. Can you kind of explain how some of those original names, like Fujiko, for example, what were the things that needed to be changed about the names and how would a period accurate Sengoku person be addressed?
Yeah, that is a big decision, but I think it was the right decision ultimately because with due respect, a lot of the names in the novel were too modern. Or sometimes it's names of a place, or sometimes it's a last name is used as a first name. So I think it's important that all the names feel historically authentic while respecting the novel, right? So Fujiko is Fuji.
Because Ko, which is, that's a very common ending for a woman's name now, but that was not really a kind of format for a name.
Not at that time. It's not completely out of the question, and also Mariko being such an iconic part of the novel, I think it was good to keep.
At the time of our story, Mariko, Toranaga, and all of the Japanese characters in Shogun have been living in a period of constant war.
There is a sort of simmering tension running through the entire piece where we're not sure if any of our lead characters might die.
This is episode 2 director Jonathan Van Tulleken.
Everyone's trying to be inscrutable and everyone's trying to also read what everyone else is thinking. And of course, this is a world where death is happening on a regular basis at this moment in time, that there was a lot of war, there was a lot of civil unrest. And so I think we were always trying to find that and find moments of that in the background. In the prison scene, we put an execution happening in episode 2, and that wasn't originally scripted, but it felt important to show to Blackthorn in that moment that death is present, death is near. And the same with the beheading in the village in episode 1. And then on the other side of just the sort of historical side of things, I think because it was a period of substantial change and sort of sitting between 2 different periods, we really spent a lot of time trying to speak to experts about, what this exact period was like.
Yeah, I mean, another huge aspect of the period is that it's when you have the Portuguese influence there, you have the Christians coming in. So I just wanted to, get a little bit of that, those sort of two worlds colliding.
What I really had taken away from the novel and when I read Justin and Rachel's first script was that we are the savages, that we are the barbarians. And I think when we wanted to depict the Christians and depict the Portuguese and the Jesuits, we really wanted to show the Japanese world as light and open and embracing nature and the food, the cleanliness of the food. And I think when we showed the Jesuits, what we wanted to show was that actually it's dark and it's fetid and they're eating greasy meat. And we had the dog licking hands, the food off the priest's hands and things, something that would just be abhorrent, which actually it is totally disgusting. And so I think that was where we really lent into it. And to be honest, it wasn't difficult to do. It was, we just looked at the historical references and it immediately opened itself up to us. We see so many stories of kind of the Westerner coming in and teaching everyone else how to live their lives and being the kind of savior. And what's great about Shogun is that is not the case.
Yeah.
That isn't how it plays out at all. And I felt that was not only correct, but super intriguing as well as a new perspective on it.
And Toranaga in particular is such a complicated character to both direct and act because there's so much going on inside and not necessarily things we see. And I was just like marveling at how he still kind of indicates that. And we see the wheels in his head turning, particularly in that first interview scene with Blackthorn, which is just great on so many levels. What were you kind of thinking going into that scene, that first meeting of Blackthorn and Toranaga?
I think just making it very first person and also really trying to get inside both their heads, that feel what Blackthorn's feeling about it all and that intimidation of this new place and this person, and both of these very smart men taking each other in and thinking about what to say next, and that all of this is pivotal, that if Blackthorn missteps, he will die. Yeah, and I think Cosmo was great at that, in that Cosmo deliberately sort of didn't really want to know what was being said to him all the time, that worked hard at trying to get his Japanese better as the show went on, so that he would try and understand more and more as Blackthorn did.
I remember when we were in the room that we really started to think about Toranaga and Blackthorn's relationship being a kind of romance of sorts, and a very complicated one that's sort of a dance back and forth. How did you kind of work with that relationship between Cosmo and Hiroyuki? Because, as we were talking about, there's a language barrier there. And how did you kind of get that to work? Because it's such an electric moment in that episode.
I think that relationship, we talked a lot about that relationship beforehand. And I think they both felt it with each other. I think they are two actors that come in hugely prepared. I mean, everyone did. And I think that in itself, from the very first day of filming, kind of brought a level of respect and engagement from each other that I think does show on screen. And also, we shot in order. A lot of the time, we did those scenes in the castle were some of the last things we shot of that episode 1 and 2 block. And so I think when we got there, Blackthorn had already experienced, for real, a lot of these things.
Yeah.
And filming was not easy. It was a very rainy, muddy exterior thing. And, he's getting covered in gunk and really having to live it. And I think it was when Cosmo gets to that place, when he gets those warm sets inside, that actually that did have an effect as well. I was very pleased we got to shoot it in order.
Is there any scene other than ones we've gotten into already that you had a lot of fun with, or that thought were particularly meaty?
I really liked, actually, into the humor of it, I really liked the scene of Ishido sort of getting armor envy and kind of being jealous. It felt very human, that someone discovering that being in power is actually not fun. Being in power is work. Being in power is like a desk job. You're a bureaucrat. And I think Ishido feeling like Toranaga was this rock star and he's this guy stamping documents and doing administration and bogged down in this formality, And, and he's got his armor, but he sort of wishes he had slightly better armor. And, I just it felt very true to life.
How did you approach Shido as a villain? Because he doesn't, at first glance, check a lot of the boxes of somebody that you're rooting against necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about him is that in many respects, he should be the hero of the story a little bit. And so that was the kind of fascinating thing, to take someone who in lots of ways is right. He's not wrong about a lot of the things he's saying and appealing to people, but he's so frustrated that you can't just be saying the right thing. You also need to be the right person to say it.
Yes.
And I think also we really went out of our way to cast someone who felt like they would be a formidable enemy to Toranaga, not sort of an old man who maybe can't quite haggard, who's maybe on his last wind. That I think that was why we got Takahiro, that I think we really felt like he brought this very unusual energy of someone who feels like by rights he should be.
Yeah.
He should be thought of as great like Toranaga, and yet just kind of falls short. I think that's what makes the narrative so compelling. That's what makes it exciting to direct, that these aren't two-dimensional characters, that it also has contemporary resonance. Careful who your leaders are, careful who we choose. We often pick people for the wrong reasons. And in fact, that's almost the richest thing, is that how do people feel at the end of this story about all our characters? How do you feel about Blackthorn? That there are whole moments, I think, where Blackthorn is just wrong. He's just racist and wrong and muddle-headed and pig-headed and stubborn, but we'll love him anyway, or we'll come to love him. And I think we love people in spite of their issues, or maybe even because of their issues. That no one loves someone who's just great.
That's all for this week's episode of Shogun, the official podcast. Next week, how will the Osaka court react to the assassination attempt? What will the Catholics do now that the Black Ship can't set sail? And will Blackthorn ever bathe again? Tune in next week when we discuss episode 3 of FX's Shogun. You can find a link in our description to episodes 1 and 2 of Shogun. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of our story, check out the official Shogun Viewer's Guide. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. Be sure to rate, review, and follow Shogun, the official podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Emily Yoshida, and I'll see you next week.
This is where the transaction will take place. Let's slip in undetected.
My lord is famous for his trickery. When he was 6 years old, his father traded him to a rival Busho. As a hostage, he learned one truth: that enemies are everywhere and friends nowhere. To show your true heart is to risk your life.
What happens if he's found?
He will be killed. And all of us.
Welcome to Shogun, the official podcast. My name is Emily Yoshida. I was a staff writer on Shogun, and I am your host on this show. Every week, we dive deeper into all the different elements that went into making Shogun with co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo, and the cast and crew that helped bring this story to life. This week, we're talking about episode 3, Tomorrow is Tomorrow. So as usual, there are spoilers ahead for this and the previous 2 episodes. Listeners should also be advised that there is some strong language and discussions of violence in this episode. On the podcast today, I'll hear how actor Nestor Carbonell learned to convincingly drown on screen, how production designer Helen Jarvis crafted those ships that raced across Osaka Harbor, and how every strike counts in a samurai fight, with stunt coordinator Loro Chartrand Del Valle. But first, let's check back in with showrunner and creator Justin Marks to talk about Toranaga's daring escape from Osaka Castle.
The boat race was, I think, the hardest thing for us to shoot on the entire series. And Charlotte Brandstrom, who directed that episode, did it in some ways on the tightest part of the schedule, too. But it's one of my favorite moments for Blackthorn, especially as a character, because it's just the moment where he's truly ride or die, where he's left behind because of the politics and he's finally been kind of counted out. And the way Toranaga looks at him almost as a test of his worth, to say, like, is this a guy who just destiny swallows up, or is this the guy who's going to make his own fate in some way? I think you could divide these characters by people who follow the wind or people who learn how to control the wind. And, I think in this case, Blackthorn just sails headlong into that wind.
You walked right into my next question, which was just going to be, in your mind, where's Toranaga and Blackthorn's relationship right now? It seems like there's been a couple key moments where we see that eye-to-eye thing even beyond this language barrier. But how much of Toranaga's trust does Blackthorn have at this point here?
I think this episode really sets the stage for where those two characters are going in the future. This idea that Toranaga looks at the people around him by one criteria really above all else, and that's loyalty. How far will this person go for my cause? What is this person willing to do? And I think in Blackthorn, he saw a very specific behavioral trait that he very much appreciates, which is this denial of what should have been his own death coming straight at him. And that's something that Toranaga escapes time and time again. And so he kind of sees himself in Blackthorn. It's a little more complex than just straight loyalty, though, because I think, and Toranaga probably recognizes that Blackthorn's sense of loyalty to Toranaga is really based on what he thinks Toranaga can give him. In this case, that he knows that Toranaga is kind of an enemy of his enemies, and that makes them very convenient allies. And I guess the question that we should be asking ourselves right now is that really loyalty? How does that work? And, what do men like Toranaga see when they see men like that? Or what do women like Mariko see when they see men like that as well? So how is that going to play out as Blackthorn gets closer and closer to Toranaga over the next few episodes is going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
So episode 3 really, really gets into the kind of the politics of the Portuguese in relation to the Japanese. And a lot of that hinges around the Black Ship. Can you explain what the Black Ship is?
The Black Ship is the source of all trade between Japan and the immediate regions outside of Japan. Because the Japanese and Chinese didn't really conduct much diplomacy at that time, the Portuguese and Spanish were responsible for being the intermediaries. So what the Black Ship would do is bring Japanese silver for Chinese silk and vice versa. The Black Ship is, perhaps most importantly, the object of Blackthorn's entire mission. He's been sent here to disrupt Spanish and Portuguese Catholic trade, and the Black Ship is the ultimate symbol of that. So, he's like a dog on a bone when he sees that ship. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, that's really Blackthorn's principal preoccupation that leads him down a very set path through most of the story.
So episode 3, was there anything that you really hope the viewer will notice or appreciate? There's obviously a lot going on, a lot of little character moments in the middle of this big action episode.
One of my favorite moments of the entire series is Buntaro's goodbye. Shinosuke Abe, who plays Buntaro, has the most incredible, heart-wrenching performance. And it was always one of my favorite scenes in the book as well as in the script. But this moment of coming to the end of the road, realizing it's the end of the road, and then going through the calculus of how you're going to choose to die, staring at his wife and all the things he probably wishes he could have said to her, and then staring at Toranaga, the lord he's going to die for, and to have Toranaga address him by his full name, not his Taro name, right, Buntaro, which is more affectionate and reserved for family, but as Toda Hirokatsu, and then bowing towards him in respect. And I'm so consumed by the power of that scene every time I watch it. Early in the process, I used to see that scene from Blackthorn's point of view, I think, as a writer and as a producer, and to be really struck by the senselessness of it. That why are you dying? You could still live. Now, having gone through the Shogun process and listened to the characters and listened to the actors playing the characters, there's only one possible choice, which is to turn back and fight and to die in that way. And it makes perfect sense. It is a perfect death. So I think that moment, for many reasons, will have many ripples throughout the rest of the story.
As Justin said, Shogun's cast of characters can be divided into those who follow the wind and those who learn to control the wind. But there's one character we meet in these first 3 episodes who might be a little more difficult to classify.
It was so much fun to dive into this crazy character.
This is the voice of the Spanish pilot Rodriguez, Nestor Carbonell.
This nutjob Spanish pilot who was hired by the Portuguese to travel and do business in Japan. And he stayed. He stayed, and he's living quite the life and adjusting to life in Japan as this nut job who gets away with everything short of murder. So that was a lot of fun to hop in to this incredible journey and as this sort of wild card.
Yeah. And like so many characters in Shogun, he is sort of caught between these different worlds and sort of exists in flux. Like, I think at the beginning, he definitely doesn't always necessarily see eye to eye with the church and with the Portuguese and all that, but he's also not completely, assimilated into Japanese culture. And then you add in this Englishman into the mix, can't help but be into Blackthorn. So how do you, for yourself, think of Rodriguez's relationship to Blackthorn?
It's so wild because, in a sense, I think he sees a younger version of himself. This is a young pilot. It's the first thing he remarks is how young he is. And then he assumes he's a Dutchman, which he's not. And then he finds out he's British, which is the enemy to him, because of the war between Catholicism and Protestantism. And yet he sort of marvels at this man's chutzpah, at his courage and his reluctance to accept his own fate. So he's at once sort of mesmerized by this guy, sees a younger version of himself in him, but he also hates him because he knows what he stands for. He stands for Protestantism. And when he finds out later on, when he reads his rudders, what he's actually done in murdering Catholics in Manila, he's definitely his sworn enemy. And yet the man saves his life. And while he's not yet willing to ally himself with Blackthorn for that reason, that does come into play when he has a chance to save Blackthorn at the end of episode 3.
Which is such a insane sequence. I mean, when we were in the room, I was trying to figure out what is this going to look like? Like, it's just so, like, these huge ships, like, racing each other, but it's, like, just felt like so many moving parts, and it's very exciting in the episode as it is.
Well, it was exciting to shoot it.
I bet.
It was extraordinary. I got to tell you, Emily, the ships that we got to steer were just massive. Even the green screens were 100 feet tall. I think they're the biggest in the world in order for us to be able to shoot with these massive ships that were also moving. They were all motorized, but they were on land, on tracks.
Oh, wow.
And so, no, it was extraordinary to shoot.
The finished product is amazing. I imagine as an actor, it's a very challenging and interesting scene to shoot as well, because there's actually so much going on between you and Blackthorn in that scene. Like
What?
The sort of love-hate really kind of comes to the top there. But you're shouting at each other over these massive, ships and everything. What was that like?
You guys wrote such beautiful humor in the face of all this tragedy, whatever. And Rodriguez certainly has a lot of those fun lines. There's, once you get to the set and you get to see what you're actually steering, and it's this pole, it's not a, it's not a wheel.
Right.
And I go, oh, that changes the scene somewhat. Because there's there's obviously this phallic moment here
Right.
that I've got to mind somehow. So I was like, as soon as that line came up, I was like, well, I know what I'm going to do.
Oh, yeah.
So that's always a fun thing as an actor when you're either dealing with props or a set that you haven't walked into. You can investigate things even on the day and say, make choices on the day. It's always fun to keep it alive like that.
I wanted to go back and talk about stunts a little bit, specifically about the big rescue at the end of 1 and all that. Was that you, or how much was a double? Like, what were you?
No, a lot of it was me.
Wow.
In fact, I think it was all me. Oh, this was so much fun. So, add the ship and everything to the mix, all of the toys we get to play with, then I drown, right? And it's like, usually you drown and whatever, and it's, it's all CGI'd, but you still have something, you need to work with something. So they built this massive pool outside with these rock formations, and I was lowered down onto a rock. They'd have to paint this wire so that they could lower me onto a rock. But before I even landed on that rock, they had to see me drown. So they threw me in this wave pool. It was this massive wave pool. And then the problem was that I had to go underwater, but because of my clothes, incredible clothes that Carlos built, I was pretty buoyant. So I asked them to see if they could put weights on my ankles so I could drown. But not so much so that I could actually really drown, because it was a pretty deep pool and there was a lot of weight. But just enough that it would sink me. And it was, I was like, this is a gift. And it was pretty warm water, too, in the middle of winter. Come on. I felt like a child.
Yeah.
I literally felt like I was on a Disney ride.
So part of what makes the show so fun to me is just that there are so many characters who are kind of like, what's in it for me? They're kind of all doing their little schemes and stuff. Blackthorn obviously is just like very quickly trying to catch up and figure out, okay, how do I not die here? But like, what do you think makes Rodriguez's style of that different than Blackthorn? Blackthorns, or then Toranaga's even, who is obviously the king of that. Like, he is the mastermind.
Oh, Tornaga's the ultimate puppet master.
Yeah.
I think his style is like, he is a madman. A lot of that he puts on. Oh, it's crazy Rodriguez. Oh, he's just going to fix this rude guy and he'll deal with him. I got him and I'll give him drink, then I'll shoot him, all this stuff, all for an ulterior motive. I think that's his style. He's like, look, I can get away with insulting these people, but I am indispensable to them in that I am a good captain and they don't have other great captains like Rodriguez is painted to be. Everybody's working each other, and I think Rodriguez, ultimately all he cares about is sort of hedonistic, is about, whatever money he can get out of it, whatever a woman he can get out of it, and whatever house he can be granted from his dealings. It's all about serving the self for him.
And that's why we love him. Rodriguez may think he sees himself in Blackthorn, but by the end of this week's episode, it's clear Blackthorn is on a very different path. In this episode, Blackthorn is brought into the fold when Toranaga bestows him with the title of Hatamoto. To have the ear, and more importantly, the trust of a lord in the Sengoku period was to have power and influence. A feudal lord like Toranaga would be supported by a whole host of samurai with a clear hierarchy. Other lords with less power, called vassals, were both allied with and subordinate to him, but somewhat independent with their own armies. Yabushige, in our story, would be considered a vassal of Toranaga. And below the vassals were the Gokenin, those samurai who served the lord directly and would fight under him in battle. Hatamoto, on the other hand, translates to near the banner or under the banner due to their literal positioning to their lord in battle, closest by their side and the last line of defense. But this closeness also applied off the battlefield and signified a strong trust in all matters. The Hatamoto had the distinguished privilege of a direct audience with their lord. For Tokugawa Ieyasu, the real Japanese lord that Toranaga is based on, there was one Hatamoto that differed from the rest. William Adams, the historical basis for Blackthorn, began as an advisor to Tokugawa on diplomacy and trade, but eventually he earned the title of Hatamoto, giving him a lot of influence when it came to foreign policy. But why was Blackthorn named Hatamoto? While it's difficult to know exactly what Toranaga is thinking in this episode, it's safe to say Blackthorn's aid in the escape from Osaka proves his potential as an ally who was willing to face danger head-on. And to create that sequence, the show's art department had the monumental task of building the two ships at the climax of the escape from Osaka, the Black Ship and Toranaga's galley.
It gave us the opportunity to kind of really create a sort of textural difference between the two.
This is Helen Jarvis, our production designer. Helen drove the vision behind each location, from the villages to the castles, the gardens, and yes, the ships.
Visually, the biggest difference, quite apart from the shape of each vessel, is the color of them. The Black Ship is effectively black because it was coated with pitch or tar, really, to preserve it. Also, the characters, the captain, there's a certain kind of, not sinister aspect to them. They are slightly brutal, they take advantage. So the blackness of the ship just seemed to echo that. By contrast, the galley is a much lighter, unfinished wood. It would be either cedar or cypress or one of those lighter woods. The Black Ship would have been oak and pine, heavier woods. So just a visual contrast there.
Did you have different teams who kind of worked on the Portuguese versus the Japanese design for these things?
No, not really. I had nautical set designers. I was lucky. I had some set designers who'd come off Peter Pan, so they were completely immersed in the European carrack style of ship. They're very different. The first thing is obvious is the size. The Black Ship was a massive 1,200-ton ship. That was my first challenge, is just in trying to reconcile the difference in the heights, because the characters had to talk to one another. Right. So we did feed the set down. We only built a partial piece of the Black Ship, little piece of the main deck, most of the top deck, and then another upper deck above that. So we did have many discussions about the relative sizes of these ships and how that would play, because a lot of the chase sequence is actually executed in post with visual effects models and such.
It's movie magic.
I hope it's all brilliantly clear to everybody.
So in this build, you were basically taking this, it was like a harbor in Vancouver, and sort of transforming it into Osaka for the most part, right? It's so interesting because with some of these settings, they do quote unquote exist today. Like, you know, you can go to Osaka Castle, but it's a completely rebuilt structure.
We had a marvelous advisor in Kyoto, Mr. Frederick Krins, and I'd have to say he had access to some extraordinary documents and scrolls and things that I'm sure are kept in vaults at the university there. A lot of the decorative elements, there's masses of information about the beautiful paintings, Fusuma, the sliding screens. And those, I thought right away, well, okay, I'm going to have the capability of changing my sets because, of course, these houses are made of panels. So that lent itself completely to shifting the scenery around, literally, and changing the look of the spaces.
Were there any details you found about the castle or, you know, the living quarters, anything in this world that you were like, we have to get this in the episodes?
I think the biggest thing for us was all the Fusuma of the many different living quarters. They were all printed. We had a fabulous illustrator who worked with me creating these scenes, using reference and creating a different feel for each character's living quarters.
Oh, wow. Like painting on the interior, the walls?
Yeah. So she would paint on such density so that you could really blow things up. And what we do is we paint and we'd gold leaf and burnish metallic finishes, and then we'd send those through a printer, very large printer, obviously. And that was fascinating. With the results we got, I do hope that they appear on screen enough, that we can actually enjoy them because they're quite beautiful.
Were there any particular details in episode 3 specifically that a viewer might not notice on first viewing, but you're just really proud of?
I think the thing that hopefully people will pick up on is that at this time, obviously glass wasn't used. Shoji screens were open to the elements. And so even in pouring rain, you would have shoji open because the rooms would be so dark otherwise.
Right.
So there's a lot of exterior that's brought in visually. That's how we lit the sets. Also flooded them with light from the gardens, from the stage sets. And also the thing that's a curiosity to me, it was very hard for everybody to get their heads around at first, was the little oil lamps that were used at that time. And so this was another thing that Frederick was very, very keen on, that we got the quality of the light correct. So these are very sort of low on short posts, these like little dishes of oil with wicks in. And that's a little hard to get your head around at first. You think, gosh, how are we going to see? How are we going to... But it's incredibly atmospheric. And I do say, it paints every scene. It brings the costumes, the texture, the colours alive. Just that lovely, quiet, subtle lighting.
Lovely, quiet, and subtle. These words may describe much of our show, but our next guest tends to work more in the violent, loud, and in-your-face department.
Everything we did with this, it was about killing.
This is the voice of Loro Chartrand Del Valle, or Lash, as he's often called on set.
I was the second unit director and stunt coordinator for the show, took care of all the action.
This show has such a diversity of choreography, especially in these first few episodes. What are the things that you kind of have to keep an eye on the most when you're sort of moving in between time periods and also just working in such a specific time period as this one?
Well, the thing with this one is we wanted to be very authentic, and today's choreography in most fight scenes, what is wanted is for entertainment. So we do a lot of extra stuff in our fight scenes these days, flips and special kicks, and we incorporate CGI. But this is entertainment, but it's also very authentic and historical. And that didn't mean that it has to be boring, because we did every kind of stunt on the show. We did horse falls, we did saddle falls, we did high falls, water work. And when we did have a fight, it was very purposeful and it connected the dots to the story. So a lot of fun, especially like when there was Shinobi. We didn't do any flips. We didn't do any, it was very stealth. It was very what they were. They were assassins. They came in, they killed, they got out.
We're here to talk about episode 3, but I would be remiss to not bring up the Shinobi scene, which is at the end of 2, just because I think that was a really tricky thing on a historical level, because there is so much maybe not quite understood or not even quite known about what, I guess what we would now call ninja, but is not exactly historically accurate would be. And so how much was history? How much was sort of your own kind of interpretation as a martial arts expert?
Well, that's where I really had to find my ground with this show because I've done a lot of other shows that have incorporated ninja or shinobi, and of course they want to go the Hollywood version, right? And so it's more superheroish, and we couldn't have any of that. And I thought maybe they want a taste of it, sort of thing. So I would go to town with the choreography, and I had talked to the writers and producers, and they were pretty clear on what they wanted. But even from that, I had to tone it down and make it more stealth and more very serious in the sense that they could be put into their position 2 to 5 years prior. So this person was just a sleeper, and then all of a sudden they're activated and away they go. And I was really proud of that stunt woman that played that character because she did it with grace and poise, and she was so obviously on a mission. She wasn't scared of being killed. She was just getting to her target.
Yeah.
And no matter what she came against, I mean, she had to deviate and take another room and go through another way and stuff like that. But it's almost like she didn't have to think about it. She had been in that castle so long.
Right.
She knew every door, every hallway, every room. So she didn't have to think, where am I going now?
Yeah.
No, nothing like that. It was just like, I'm going here, going there, going there.
Yeah.
And I'll come in this door and I'll meet him right there.
So 3 is just after a lot of kind of political table setting, a lot of, people talking in rooms and tension. We suddenly have a ton of action in this episode. So was there kind of a scene within this that, you kind of looked at the assignment and were like, okay, how am I going to tackle that one?
Yeah, well, the components of the ambush were huge. And I had so many stunt people working, and we had so many actors involved that and so many extras. The number was just huge. So, I mean, first off, you get the script and you read it. And there was just so many components of that whole ambush sequence because there was stops for dialogue and hiding behind this and then attacking that and being attacked, flaming arrows coming in, somebody's trying to get away so they can deliver a message, and guy gets shot off a horse. And we had some flaming arrows practical, and then we had a lot of CG ones. And then you have to sit there and plan out with the editor and with the CG producer and with the director and figure out where are these CG arrows coming from, who's firing them, and where are they coming from, because I have to have my real people react to it.
Yeah.
So you have to know exactly when an arrow's coming. Okay, you got to dodge that, or you got to duck here, or my stunt guy's getting hit and you're falling down, and oh, you're catching on fire, so then we got to light him on fire as well.
Yeah.
So it was just like up and down the line. There was different stories being told throughout this group of 100 people. So, I have to work with the director very closely and coordinate how that action is going to help tell that story, because each story is bridged with a big chunk of action.
Yeah.
It's so many people putting it all together and working hand in hand to make it happen.
Oh, yeah. So within the sequence, one of the many things going on in it is we get to see Mariko for the first time fighting with her naginata. This was like very much the weapon of a woman of that class in that time, and this would not have all been out of place.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, women were samurai too. They came from, it was all a family situation, so they were trained more often or not, from what I've been told, was to protect the village and protect home when the samurai warriors were away at battle. And so the naginata is like a spear, but it's curved end, and it's more like a sword on the end of a pole, right? So they've got a long distance sword, so to speak. So that was the weapon of choice for the women, but men used it too.
It looks so heavy. Are they heavy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We made lighter versions of them. If you have a real one, it's quite a bit heavier because you have a steel blade, but we often didn't use the steel blade for safety reasons, and we had bamboo blades, and so they were much lighter and easier to use.
I mean, it feels like almost counterintuitive for it to be the weapon of choice for these like noble women, just because of, it feels like such a big ungainly thing.
It is a longer range weapon, so if a bigger opponent gets inside, you're in trouble. So to keep them back, and I mean, they were razor sharp, so you could cut them from a distance. And that's the other thing with this action, is that a lot of it was over quickly, because you get cut with one of those swords or that naginata and you're done. That's it. It's not just a little stab. It's your arms coming off, or your head, or, One of the biggest things that I fought for is, you'll see in a lot of fight scenes today, especially when it comes to sword work or any weapon work, that the stunt guys, they'll clack their swords over their head. This guy will attack, and that guy didn't even need to block because he's swinging too high. So if you're attacking somebody, you got to attack for the target. And that's even more important when they're wearing armor, because there's only 2 or 3 points where you can get through that armor.
Right.
So it's got to be for the neck, it's got to be under the armpit, it's got to be the back of the knee, places like that. And so if they weren't hitting it, I'd call bullshit.
Right.
And then I finally got my stunt crew all together, and I said, look, you guys, we can't have any bullshit on this show. You know, I'm not gonna go for that, and I don't want to call you out. I don't want to embarrass you. So what are we not gonna do? And everyone would yell, "No bullshit!" It was like our battle cry, "No bullshit." So the producers and directors got a good kick out of that.
Oh,
'cause
that's great.
We go to start a battle, and what are we gonna have? No bullshit. Okay, ready and action.
I love that. That's all for this week's episode of Shogun, the official podcast. What will the death of Buntaro mean for Mariko? Is Toranaga safe outside of Osaka? And how will Blackthorn handle his new title? Tune in next week as we discuss episode 4 of FX's Shogun. You can find a link in our description to episodes 1 through 3 of Shogun. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of our story, check out the official Shogun Viewer's Guide. There's a link to that in our show notes as well. Be sure to rate, review, and follow Shogun, the official podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Emily Yoshida, and I'll see you next week.
I may be new, but I'll fight to win. Ready when you are.
Before you meddle with our politics, just remember, we live and we die. We control nothing beyond that.
Welcome to Shogun, the official podcast. My name is Emily Yoshida, and I was a writer on the show. And after each episode, I dive deeper into the different elements that went into making Shogun, with co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo, along with the cast and crew that helped bring this story to life. This week, we're talking about episode 4, The Eightfold Fence. So this is a quick heads up that there will be spoilers for this and the previous 3 episodes. And yes, as you might have noticed, I'm a credited writer on this episode, so trust me, I've been waiting a long time to get into it. On the podcast today, I'll hear about what Mariko sees in Blackthorn from actress Anna Sawai, what Fuji's role as consort really meant with historian Frederick Krenz, and what it was like to open up the world of the village of Ajiro with director Fred Toy. But first, let's talk about where the episode gets its name. A space where someone like Mariko might hide their emotions and reactions from the world.
I mean, the Eightfold Fence is where our characters are taught to retreat to when the chaos of the world becomes a bit too overwhelming.
Co-creator Rachel Kondo returns to help us understand why this idea of privacy and keeping your emotions close to the vest was so important to our characters.
The Eightfold Fence is a very lovely moment. I mean, I like that Mariko starts it off with, have you heard of the Eightfold Fence? Like it's this very common thing.
Yeah.
And it's not. I think it's this amazing cultural tool that they had. It's this private, protected space that allows them a sense of agency, and it's the only way to control the chaos is to kind of retreat to a place in which you exist on your own terms.
It's such an interesting idea because when you describe it like that, I think of how it's almost inverse for somebody like Blackthorn. The sense of agency, the drive to be his own person and set his own course is very externalized. And we see it, it's not hidden at all. And that is, kind of a constant sort of contrast between him and Mariko. They're very, very different in that way, culturally and just personally.
If she is saying nothing, he's like speaking through a loudspeaker. He wears his blackthorn-ness on his sleeve, and it's hard for him to not be himself. And I think as Westerners, we get that.
Well, that's what we recognize as a hero, is just somebody who's, not afraid to be themselves and be out there. And it's just such a very different approach to Mariko, who's one of our, Mariko and Toranaga in very different ways kind of have a similar complexity or kind of, hiddenness to them, I guess.
Yeah, I think if we, as in Westerners / Blackthorns of the world, we have our plans, right? And then we have reactions for when plans don't work out. And I think that the Toranagas and the Marikos of our story rely more heavily on the reaction part.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they're on their heels. It's just that there's a quietness to the watching and the waiting. And Blackthorn is a little more stormy, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. We also, in this episode, really start to get a sense of Nagakado's position as Toranaga's son and the pressure that that puts on him and his, real ambition to live up to his dad's name. And a lot of this we got through his sort of relationship or rivalry with Omi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about their very special friendship and how these two young men, kind of in sort of similar but, very different positions define themselves in contrast to each other.
So Nagakado he's in that tough and not so tough position, like you put it, pressurized position of being born into great wealth and acclaim, essentially. And in those circumstances, I think it's normal that, Tornaga, as his father, this great leader, is going to be what he fixates on, right? As a source of resentment, but also the one person he reveres more than anybody else. So what's interesting about Nagakado's relationship with Omi, though, is that Omi has had to, I feel like Nagakado could have been an Omi almost if given a different birthright. If he hadn't been born into this grand lineage, maybe he would have been like an Omi, and Omi had to learn how to scheme. He had to learn how to think outside the box. He had to learn how to make himself of value to more powerful men. And so that's what's so fun about bringing these two characters together, is that the all vulnerable Nagakado is kind of read like a book by Omi. And it's very clear that Nagakado kind of is saying to Omi what he wishes he could say to his father.
Right.
And he can't. And this is the instance in which maybe he might want to slip behind his eightfold fence, and not spill it all.
Yeah.
So
it makes me wonder what kind of father Toranaga is and how much he's teaching his son, because Toranaga is obviously, even at this point, like the master of this, sort of, very strategically concealing his plans and his motivations and everything. And it doesn't seem like Naga has inherited all of that wisdom quite yet, but he's young, so.
Well, it goes back to that line. I think it was in episode 3 where Nagakado's like, "Come on, Dad, I'm your son. Why am I so unworthy of you sharing what the plan is?" Or, whatever it is. And Toranaga's response is, "Why are you playing this game of friends and enemies? This is like a young, unthinking person's mindset. You have only yourself in this world, Nagakado, and i.e., once again, your eightfold fence. If you could just take a breather and slip behind there."
Obviously, he doesn't do that in the end of this episode. He kind of sets out on his own and basically, without telling anybody, turns the cannon that they've been training with on Jozen. What is going to be the fallout from this? This seems like a pretty impulsive action that could have some consequences.
There's no turning back from this. I mean, this is Nagakado making the choice that I'm going to choose this moment in which to release all this pressure that I have on myself and just be who I want to be and do what I want to do. And I'm just going to hope that my father, Toranaga, sees that I had courage in this and that I had an idea. And we'll have to wait and see what Toranaga's reaction is.
Well, Mariko, I believe, at the end of the episode says it's a war. She puts that out there. But it's been interesting talking about this period of time and how common war was, that statement, maybe somebody says it's war every week.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it's just Tuesday at 3:00 in the afternoon.
As Nagakado's actions throw our characters into the risk of a violent conflict, Mariko stands strong and resolute in the face of war.
I think Mariko is the most graceful, yet immensely powerful figure that I've ever come across. And I just fell in love, and I told them that I really wanted to do it.
This is Anna Sawai, the actress that portrayed Tora Mariko.
We've seen a lot of Japanese-based shows or movies, but I really believe that nothing has been this accurate in the past. Justin, our showrunner, he wasn't afraid to trust our Japanese producers and advisors. And I think that's huge. I think that's what makes this so special, is that it's really the marriage of Western and Japanese.
This is the episode where Blackthorn kind of gets installed as Hatamoto in Ajiro, and Mariko has to kind of facilitate it and introduce him to Fuji and kind of basically be the presence of Toranaga there. And at the same time, she's going through, grief. There's just so much going on. How do you think Mariko balances the duty and what she's going through emotionally in this episode?
I think she's going through grief in a way that, yes, she lost her son's father. But I don't think she really loved him because he was the one that was kind of stopping her from doing what she wanted to do. And he had a very purposeful death. So I think she grieves the loss of a honorable samurai, but in a way, it's a relief because once her mission is accomplished, she won't have anyone stopping her from doing what she wants to do.
And her position is so unique then, but it kind of feels like she's a career woman or something in a world where that's very uncommon. And she's got this very important and specific job that she has to do.
I think by this point, though, she's starting to feel like she wants to do it. She's feeling useful. And before that, she didn't have any mission. She wasn't given any job. And now she's kind of amongst the men and feeling like there's something to live for in a way. I think the reason why she was doing it before was because she has her son and she wasn't allowed to make her own choices. But Toranaga-sama has promised her that once this is over, she'll have what she wants. And so she's moving straight forward right now.
We've discussed in previous episodes just Mariko's real life inspiration, Hosokawa Gracia. How much did you kind of research and study her? Was that a big part of your prep for playing Mariko?
It was a big part of playing Mariko. But at the same time, I didn't want to do too much. I didn't want to be precious with all the facts because this is based on James Clavell's novel and it's based on those figures, but it's not a historical book.
Right.
So I talked to Rachel Kondo a lot. She's been researching for years. I heard stories of her grandma. So Mariko, I think, is a little bit of all these figures, Hosokawa Garasha, Rachel's grandma, Rachel, my mom, all the women that have fought in order to bring us here today.
For you, what's the moment where you think that Mariko really starts to see something in Blackthorn beyond just being the Anjin that she's sort of charged with?
I don't know if there's a specific moment, but I think throughout the course of interacting with him, she starts to see that he sees her as a human being, that he's not looking at her as a woman who should be silenced and ignored like the other lords or men. I think she doesn't agree with a lot of what he says, but what he is saying is very intriguing to her. And so it's a very slow, gradual burn.
But it is interesting that their exchanges are kind of more, well, I guess exactly that, like exchanges.
And I think because with the other lords, she would have to pay respect. There was always a wall, whereas when she first meets Blackthorn, she's kind of like, who the hell is this person?
Yeah.
And she doesn't really have to be anything that she's not. She doesn't really care what he thinks.
Yeah.
Which also allows her to get close to him.
What do you think she ultimately sees in him?
Opposites attract. I mean, I think it's so foreign. How he views the world is so foreign, and she wishes that she could see it in the way he does, knowing that she can't. And maybe that's why she even wants it more. I think she'll always believe in her core that, you know, your life is not meant to be what you want to do, but it's supposed to serve a purpose. She'll always believe that, but he's showing her that there could be more and that he cares. He cares about what she wants. And I think that itself is enough to really get into him.
But there is also still a degree to which Mariko is hiding who she is from Blackthorn. And I've been really interested to talk about this with some of the other actors, just this actual idea of the eightfold fence and also the idea of the three hearts that's kind of been discussed in previous episodes of being kind of an interesting metaphor for how to get into a character. Did you find any of those ideas useful when you were sort of imagining Mariko and all of the layers of her character?
I feel like it definitely is something that is true to every character. Obviously, the ones that the public sees, the ones that the closest people see, and then the true self that you only have. And I don't know about you, but I think that that's very true for me as well. So it wasn't hard to like think about. It just naturally happened. And I think to her, Blackthorn was not who she expected to really open up to show maybe the second heart.
Right. Yeah.
But he ended up being that. And so I think being able to share that with him was also a relief.
Yeah.
In a way.
The oldest collection of mythologies and histories in Japan, dating back to 712 AD, is called the Kojiki. The name Kojiki translates to records of ancient matters, and it contains everything from legends to biographical accounts of historical figures. Most importantly, it tells the creation myth of the islands of Japan and the origin stories of the deities that look over them. And it includes one of Japan's first recorded poems. An eightfold fence I make, an eightfold fence to protect my wife, the eightfold fence of Izumo, where 8 clouds rise. The poem is attributed to Susanoo no Mikoto, the stormy, unpredictable god of the sea. A son of Izanagi, the god of creation who's said to have created the islands of Japan, Susanoo stands among a family of gods. His siblings were sun goddess Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon. In one story, Susanoo saves a family from a many-headed beast that was terrorizing them and devouring their daughters. In exchange, Susanoo asked for their only remaining daughter to take as a wife. As he took on this fearsome beast, he kept his new bride close, transforming her into a comb that he wore into battle. Emerging victorious, he built his new bride Kushinada a palace, a fortress of safety surrounded by a manyfold fence. Though in translation the poem reads eightfold fence and 8 clouds, the translation does not fully encompass the meaning. In ancient Japanese writings, the number 8 was used to represent many or from all directions. So an eightfold fence is no ordinary protection. A manyfold fence protects from every direction, the perfect place to hide. The poem and its fences have been interpreted in many different ways. Perhaps Susanoo looked up into the sky and saw the hosts of clouds as a sign of good fortune, shelter over his palace surrounded by its many layers of fences. Or perhaps he looked up and saw the gathering dark clouds as a threat, as an omen that danger could come from all directions, and so Kushinada must be protected from all directions. But beyond the protection from dangers outside, the fortress created a private place, a place where 2 newlyweds could be kept in seclusion, alone, and at peace. Mariko sees the eightfold fence in herself, a place where she can find shelter from her family, from her past, from the pressures of society, where she can store the feelings that she can't wear on her sleeve. And though Mariko is a Christian, she seems to see herself in the words of this ancient Shinto god.
If you are a lord in Sengoku periods, you always have a lot of people around you. There was no privacy at all, and you can see that in the houses, it's mostly open, to say so.
Back on the podcast to discuss the lives and titles of feudal lords and their households is historian Frederick Krenz.
And you have, for example, diaries of lords at the time who say that we are never alone. Even if we go to the toilet, there are koshos coming with me, and so there's no privacy at all. And that was really one of the great aspects of the show, and realistic aspects, that they always had a lot of people around them.
I mean, it's interesting because I feel like that goes hand in hand then with the title of this episode and the theme of the eightfold fence and the three hearts, and kind of, if you're going to be in a world where you're never alone and where everybody's listening and, you know, the walls are literally made of paper, you have to preserve something inside of yourself that can be your own. And that's such a big theme for so many of the characters. Fuji comes back in this episode, and we meet her again after she's had this, you know, very tragic loss in the first episode. And now she is enlisted by Toranaga to be the consort to Blackthorn, who has now been given the title of Hatamoto. Can you kind of explain that role of consort, and how is it different from, say, a wife?
That's a little bit different in the Japanese and the English, because in Japanese they call her seishitsu, which means legal wife. Because Blackthorn, to become a Hatamoto, he has to be part of a samurai family. So in a way, when he marries Fuji, he's adopted into Fuji's family. So now he has the credentials to become Hatamoto. That's really a nice aspect, because William Adams too, he was married to a Japanese wife. He had 2 children with her, but we only know about her that she also came from a samurai family. So most probably Tokugawa Ieyasu arranged the marriage. So Toranaga arranging the marriage between Fuji and Blackthorn is quite accurate too.
So Fuji, as his consort, is basically his legal wife, but she also has this responsibility of being the manager of the household, basically. At the time of the story, what were some of the responsibilities of a person like Fuji?
The legal wife of the lord was called Okugata. Okugata means the person who is innermost room of the house. So there, she was the one mostly who did all the management of the household. In some cases, when her husband dies in battle or something, sometimes those wives took over the clan and administered it. So the women had quite important roles in the Sengoku period, and this is something which is quite different from the Edo period. In the Edo period, the women are really in the back of the house. They are almost imprisoned there, and all political power goes into the hands of the man. But in the Sengoku period, the wives still had much more power and influence than afterwards. And this is also a nice aspect of the show. Women are playing important roles, and I like that part very much.
A big change that happened from both the book and early drafts of the episode was that originally Blackthorn's assignment in Ajiro was to train Yabushike's army with the muskets. This got changed for historical reasons, as I understand. So can you kind of walk me through that change and what the historically accurate thing was in this case?
Oh yes, I remember. That's one thing I brought up to Justin, because guns, matchlock guns, were already introduced in Japan in the 1540s. So half a century before Blackthorn came. So what can he teach the Japanese then? It's they already know. So then I came up with the cannon, because cannon were also introduced into Japan by the Portuguese already, but those were much smaller. And the cannons on the ship cannons, they were much larger and much more powerful. Cannon became a game changer in the siege of Osaka in 1615. And those cannon were supplied by the English and the Dutch. So that could have been, from my point of view, an option for Blackthorn to instruct. And historically seeing, the Dutch who washed ashore in Japan on Blackthorn's ship, they instructed Ieyasu's forces in the use of cannon. So it would be historically accurate to do that. So there is a continuity in this story. Afterwards, cannon will become important.
As Toranaga and Blackthorn arrive in Ajiro, the whole town has come together to put their best foot forward for their lord.
I think that was kind of the whole idea of the show for me, is this idea of sort of like opening up an ideology, opening up a whole other world that was seemingly so foreign
You're hearing Fred Toy, the director of today's episode.
This was our opportunity to open that up. This was our opportunity on the arrival of Tornaga, the ceremonial nature of it, and also the energy of the village. And now these two cultures ultimately can coexist in this very small period of time in which they come to understand each other. And so for me, it was opening up Ajiro in a way that I could understand what it was like for such a big event to happen.
Also, while we're opening up Ajiro, we're kind of introducing it again, basically from the ground up. And also at the same time, we get to see the house and sort of the inner workings of a household. And this is all kind of mostly seen through Fuji, who's Blackthorn's consort. But what was important to you to convey about the house and the dynamic, all the little dynamics in it?
I think in the first scenes when they come into the house, there's an awkwardness by intention that was Blackthorn feeling completely out of place, not understanding what Fuji's role was going to be and how important she was to the household, not understanding what everybody did, not understanding how America was going to fit into that world for him. And so between the amazing design, Helen Jarvis, who was our production designer, designed all of that. That was built. Obviously, those houses were built for the production. And Ajiro, the upper Ajiro village was built in an RV parking lot at a place called the Swiss Gun Club, which is in Coquitlam in British Columbia. And she had the vision to be able to come into literally like where people park their campers for vacation and say, if I just cleared all of this stuff out and I put down, I could create a village here. And so the Blackthorn house was built there along with all of the other houses in the village. And over the course of the 10 episodes, we shot it like crazy. So that was a practical house. It wasn't on the soundstage. We were at the mercy of the elements in filming that house. So we had snow, we had rain, we had heat, we had cold, we had every possible iteration that I believe when I watch the show now plays a huge role in creating a real sense of character for that house.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Toranaga's plan here. He's leaving Yabushige and Blackthorn behind, and Blackthorn is to teach this army how to use the cannon from his ship. But in the book, if people have read it, and also in the original drafts of our script, it was not cannons, it was muskets. And this obviously got changed, and now we have cannons in the show. But I was wondering if the change from muskets to cannon sort of changed how you saw, the shape or the direction of this episode.
I think that what was interesting about the fact that we ended up with cannons was there's a brutish nature of that's so completely unsubtle and goes against what the samurai believe. Yeah. And the fact that the cannons were chosen, to me, is a great way of saying, like, this is what it was like having these, both the Portuguese and the English and the Dutch show up in Japan at this period of time. It was brutish.
Mm-hmm. It's a very bloody scene in the book with the whole Jozen massacre scene all the same, yeah. Even without it being canon. But that's the point, is that it's really ugly and it's horrifying to everybody on the ground what that kind of warfare looks like. And everybody, there's this feeling of this kind of curse of the presence of these weapons.
Yeah. Well, we tried to make it pretty horrifying when he gets it with the cannon.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's just sort of like, disassemble a body on contact.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty.
The other major development of this episode is Mariko and Blackthorn kind of growing closer together and kind of the first sort of romantic moments of their relationship. So how did you kind of build that connection between Anna and Cosmo, and how did both of their characters individually, how did you see them kind of changing the way they saw each other, I guess, in this episode?
Cosmo and Anna were very close, and I think that they had a really wonderful working relationship. So we did a lot of rehearsals. Mm-hmm. So we spent a lot of time together just offline, just talking about the experience for each one of them. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, I think that I was benefiting from both the way that the interpretation of the relationship was depicted in the script and also the approach we were taking, in the sense that I think that we wanted to understand Mariko's point of view in a way more than we did Blackthorn's. Mm-hmm. And whether that's a case of seeing that, like, it's natural with her strength, how he would feel about her, but also the fact that we wanted to understand from the Japanese point of view how a person coming in from the outside like this could be an interesting person, a person who was offering something that had never been seen before. And so for me, I think that I focused very strongly on getting inside of Mariko's head, both visually and from a story standpoint, trying to understand like, for example, in the Eightfold Fence scene, that we had this benefit of the rain and the elements to play with, that we would have an introduction kind of for the first time of presenting from an extremely intelligent and sensitive point of view an ideology that we have yet to have really understand, and understanding how that plants a flag for Blackthorn to begin to change his perspective.
That's all for this week's episode of Shogun, the official podcast. Next week, how will Toranaga react to Nagakado's assault on Ishido's troops? Can Mariko and Blackthorn's newly blossoming romance withstand their circumstances? And will Yabushige's newest play for survival pan out? Tune in next week when we discuss episode 5 of FX's Shogun. You can find a link in our description to episodes 1 through 4 of Shogun. And if you want to dive deeper into the world of our story, check out the official Shogun Viewer's Guide. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. Be sure to rate, review, and follow Shogun, the official podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Emily Yoshida, and I'll see you next week.
Yes, yes. There will be a terrible stench. But this is a gift from Toranaga-sama. It must be the best pheasant this village has ever prepared. Now, this next part is very important. No one is to touch this bird.
Welcome to Shogun, the official podcast. I'm Emily Yoshida, and I was a writer on this series. And each week, after every episode, I'll be diving deeper into the biggest twists and behind-the-scenes stories from the FX series, with co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo, along with the cast and crew that helped bring this story to life. Today, we'll be talking about episode 5, Broken to the Fist. And you know the deal by now, lots of spoilers for this and all previous episodes ahead. On the podcast today, I'll hear about what it was like to perform in a landslide with Cosmo Jarvis. We'll learn the reason behind Uejiro the gardener's death with actor Moeka Hoshi, who plays Fuji. And we'll learn the dark symbolism of Buntaro's archery stunt with producer Mako Kamitsuna. But first, we need to talk about that dinner.
We used to call it the dinner date from hell.
Yes.
Just of like the worst perfect storm group of characters to have to put together at the worst possible time in their story.
That's showrunner Justin Marks. The unforgettable centerpiece of this week's episode is the dinner between Blackthorn, Buntaro, Mariko, and Fuji, a pressure cooker of a scene that ends up revealing something about every character in the room, starting with Mariko.
Mariko, up to this point in the story, has been such a mystery when it comes to the specifics of what lies beneath the surface of her family, of her own role in all of this. You know, we've had allusions to it as early as the first episode when it comes to, you know, what baggage is Mariko carrying with her. But for the first time, to finally understand who her father was, what he did, you know, and really, in a lot of ways, to really understand more about
guys.
the marriage to Mariko and Buntaro and just how
I'm out.
complex it is because of